Hey everyone, how's it going? Forrest here, again with another installment of my complete analysis of all of Bach's chorale harmonizations. Today we're looking at Heil Gott dich loben wir, which translates to Lord God, we praise you. This is a very harmonically dense chorale, but for all intents and purposes, it is fairly straightforward to analyze, so we're just going to hop right into the analysis so the video doesn't carry on for too long. We have two sharps in the key signature. We start on B minor and we end on D major. However, I think that we start the chorale in the key of F sharp minor, another example of a key signature, a starting chord and an ending chord that doesn't agree with the key of the first phrase, but I do think the overall tonality of the chorale is D major. We start off with B minor, which is a 4 chord, and let me also reiterate, but explain why I think we're in the key of F sharp minor. For starters, we have F sharp minor descending scale in the bass, B, A, G sharp, and F sharp, and in the tenor, we have a chromatically ascending line with F sharp melodic minor, D natural, D sharp, D sharp, E sharp, F sharp, which is all hinting at the idea of F sharp melodic minor. If not F sharp melodic minor, F sharp's being heavily tonicized here, but I believe we're in the key of F sharp minor. However, our first cadence is a half cadence in the key of E minor. Very unusual change, seeing that F sharp minor and E minor are not adjacent to one another on the circle of fifths. So we go from F sharp minor, B minor, B, D, F sharp, and B, to A, D sharp, F sharp, and B, which is B7 over A. And instead of looking at this like a secondary dominant, this is actually a harmonization of the melodic minor scale, like I just said. This is 4, 4, 2. So we have some cross relations going on, D natural and D sharp, but actually those aren't cross relations. This is just an ascending chromatic line. Let's see if I can draw that 4 a little bit better. Sorry, my table that I'm recording this video on is not the most friendly space-wise. I'm used to recording on a larger table. But then we have G sharp, E sharp, G sharp, and B, which is E sharp diminished over G sharp. That's 7, 6 in the key of F sharp minor, and then that resolves where we would expect F sharp minor, F sharp, C sharp, and A, which is our tonic triad in root position. We get another F sharp triad on the next beat, F sharp, A, and C sharp, with a passing G sharp in the bass, before we get A major, A, C sharp, E, and C sharp. And this C sharp is actually part of E sharp melodic minor, C sharp, D sharp, E sharp. So I think this A major chord, which is the mediant in the key of F sharp minor, is actually our pivot chord to the key of E minor. It is now our major subdominant. And as a passing chord here, we get D sharp, F sharp, A, and C. They're passing tones, but this spells 7, 4, 3, fully diminished, before we get E, G, and B, which is E minor in root position, which is our tonic triad, 4, 7, 3 in normative progression, before we cadence on B major, B, D sharp, F sharp, and B, which is our 5 chord. And here we have some juxtaposition of major and minor in the opposite direction. So we have B major here, followed by B minor here. This prepares us to directly modulate to the key of D major. So this B minor chord is not our tonic, but rather our submediant. It's our 6. And it starts a chord progression that we would expect in the key of D minor. D major, not D minor. So we have B minor going to E, C sharp, G natural, and B, which is C sharp minor 7 flat 5 over E. That's 7, 6, 5. And that does not go to D major, even though we have some of the makings of D major here. We have F sharp and A. The only difference being is that we have a C sharp here in the tenor, which we can make, this makes this an F sharp minor chord, so a bit of a deceptive progression, or maybe not even deceptive, but following the cycle of falling fifths, 7 going to 3, that's where we would expect it to go. And then we have a passing 7th here in the alto before we get G major, G, B, D, and B, which is a 4 chord in the key of D major. We have some passing tones in the upper voices, which turns this chord actually into another C sharp minor 7 flat 5 chord, C sharp, E, G, and B. So C sharp minor 7 flat 5 in second inversion, so 7 4 3, which resolves where we would expect. So another 4 7 1 progression, F sharp, A, F sharp, and D, our tonic triad, D major in first inversion. Neighbor tone in the bass before we get another D major triad in first inversion, just with some vocal exchange, the melody and the tenor switch, so no need to reanalyze. Passing tone in the bass before we get A major, A, C sharp, E, and A, which is our 5 chord, and then we go to D major in root position, D, A, D, and F sharp, making this an imperfect authentic cadence because the D is not in the melody, but we still have a dominant tonic cadence. Alright, next cadence is, I'm calling it a perfect authentic cadence in the key of A major, but I think you could make the argument that it is also a half cadence in the key of D major, but I hear it as a perfect authentic cadence, so that's how I'm going to analyze it. But we're in the key of D major for a while, so we start off again with a B, not a B minor chord, sorry, I did not look at the melody. We start off with a G major chord in first inversion, B, B, D, and G, 4 6. That goes to C sharp, A, E, and E, which is A major over C sharp, that's a 5 6 chord. Then we have A, C sharp, and G, which is an incomplete A7 chord, so we're just rotating the previous chord and adding a 7th, but remember there's no 5th, so our figured bass would not be 7 5 3, but rather just 7 3. And then we go to D major, D, A, D, and F sharp, which is our tonic triad. You can make the argument that the modulation is happening as early as maybe even this A major chord over here, but really, I think this E is where we start to see the A major scale going up because it's part of a larger phrase that is later contextualized in the key of A. So I think this A major triad in first inversion on beat 4 is our modulation point, C sharp, A, E, and E, which is 5 6 in the key of D major, but it's also 1 6 in the key of A major. We then have D, A, D, and F sharp, which is our tonic, no longer our tonic triad, it is now our subdominant with a passing 7th in the bass before we get B, B, D, and G sharp. That's G sharp diminished over B. That's 7 6, so a 1 4 7 6, and then we cadence on 1, A, C sharp, E, and A. So we're seeing an authentic cadence where we have not 5 going to 1, but 7 going to 1, and I think we've seen an imperfect authentic cadence, or 2 or several like this before, but we haven't seen perfect authentic cadences with 7 going to 1. Maybe 1 actually. We might have seen 1, but I can't recall confidently enough. I feel like intuitively we probably have, but they're definitely not very common, so it's interesting to see 7 substitute 5 in the wild. We would definitely expect an E in this chord somewhere, but instead we get D, no E. Sometimes we get both E and D, but in this case no, we just have a G sharp diminished chord. Regardless, we're moving back to the key of D major for this phrase, only to move to the key of E minor again for another half cadence in the key of E minor at the end of the phrase. So we start things off with another A major triad, A, C sharp, E, and A, which I think is our pivot chord back to the key of D major. It is our 5 chord, and then we get D major, D, D, F sharp, and A, which is our tonic triad, passing tone in the bass, and then we get D major over F sharp, D, A, and F sharp, D, F sharp, and A, which is a tonic triad in first inversion. We'll just write the figured bass in, and then we see this bass figure that we see often in Bach's music, step, step, skip, which takes us back to root position briefly. I like to mark it, but no need, it's not super important. And then we get a G major triad, G, D, G, and B, which is our 4-chord in root position with a passing 7th in the alto. However, I think this is our modulation point back to the key of E minor, and we are going to call this G chord now our mediant. We then get C, E, E, and G, which is C major in root position. That is our 6th chord, passing 7th in the bass and passing tone in the tenor before we get A, C, F sharp, and A. You could make an argument that this is a 2-6 chord, which probably would make sense in a cadential situation because we would expect 6 to go to 2 via the cycle of falling fifths. However, I think this F sharp is an accented non-chord tone, and in fact what's really being implied here is the D sharp, A, C sharp, and A. So we're actually getting an incomplete 7 chord in some adjacent harmony. We have a D sharp fully diminished 7th, and remember the 3 is not an important tone in a diminished 7th chord. Sometimes we see Bach omit it because the 3 is not a tone that provides as much context as the 5th or the 7th does in a diminished 7th chord, the same way that the 5th does not provide as much context as the root or the 3rd does in a major or a minor triad. It's the 5th that defines the diminished triad, so that's what we would expect there. You could say this is a 2 going to a 7, but I think it's more likely that 7 is here because it's followed immediately by a tonic triad, and 7 would be a more likely preceding chord. So E, B, E, and G, that's our tonic triad, E minor, and then we cadence on B major, B, B, D sharp, and F, which is our 5 chord. Okay, looking ahead, we have a perfect authentic cadence in the key of D major, and similar to the beginning of the second phrase, we get a direct modulation where we have some cross relations here, D sharp against D natural. So this is a direct modulation to the key of D via B minor compared to B major again. It's an interesting motive that stays, that has stayed consistent throughout the chorale. That wasn't just an individual moment. It's something that we're seeing for the second time now, so it's interesting that it's recurring again. So this D minor, or this B minor chord is our submediant in the key of D major, and we are looking, we're actually going to stay on the key of D major for the entirety of this phrase. So on beat 1 of the second system, we have A, C sharp, and E. That's A major in root position, which is our 5 chord, and then we have E, G, B, and G. And we could call this a 2 chord, but for the same reason why we did not call the previous 2 chord a 2 chord as our preferred analysis, we're going to call this actually a C sharp diminished chord in first inversion, C sharp, E, G, because even though we're seeing 5 go to 7 here in first inversion, we're getting a tonic triad immediately afterwards, so I feel like it makes more sense for the chord on this beat to be dominant as opposed to predominant. But I think both chords are more or less achieving the same thing. That's why I offer both analyses, because it's unclear. So, and we have D major in first inversion, F sharp, A, D, and F sharp, which is our tonic triad. First inversion, passing tone in the bass before we get A, C sharp, and E, which is our dominant triad, A major in in root position. Passing tones in the upper voices kind of introduces a passing 1-6-4 chord, D, F sharp, A, and A, but we don't need to focus on that too much. It doesn't really enrich the progression too much, so I'm not going to analyze it, but we can talk about it. Then we have G, B, E, and G. Bit of a transitive progression here. We would expect 5 to go to 1, but here we have it going to 2-6, or depending on how you see it, I'm calling this D a passing tone here. You could consider the E an accented non-chord tone, and this chord is instead a G major triad because the D would be our chord tone. They're both achieving the same thing, so I don't think one is any more correct than the other. I'm just choosing 2-6 because it's literally on the downbeat. And then we have A major, A, C sharp, and E. That's our 5 chord with a passing 7th in the tenor. And then we cadence on D major, D, F sharp, A, and D, which is our tonic triad. Okay, looking ahead, we get another half cadence in the key of E minor. So we're looking for a point in which we modulate, and I think we stay in D for a little while. We don't modulate straight away, but we have an interesting progression here. So we start off with C sharp, A, E, and A, which is A major in first inversion. That's a 5-6 chord. And then we go to D major, D, D, F sharp, and A. And we might be tempted to call that a tonic triad, but look at this passing C natural here. What this C natural does is it makes me think that this D is not being contextualized as a tonic triad, but rather a secondary dominant. So even though it's a passing tone, I think it imparts a change of character on the chord on the strong beat, turning it into 5 of 4, because D also happens to be the dominant of G major, which is our subdominant. And then on the next beat we get a delayed resolution. We would expect G on the next beat, but we don't get it until beat 3. So we have B, D, F sharp, and A, but I think this B is an accented non-chord tone actually, and what we really get is A, D, F sharp, and A, and we get a passing 6-4 chord. So we have this long G major scale fragment going on here in a descending fashion in the bass. So we have 5 of 4, 5, 6, 4 of 4, and then we finally get 4 on beat 3, G, D, G, and B, which is our 4 chord. And I think this also happens to be our pivot chord to the key of E minor. It is now our mediant, and I feel like we've seen the same thing before, where we're going from D major and G is our pivot chord. So it's interesting that we're seeing that. We're also seeing kind of a similar figuration where the chord that precedes it is being inverted over 2 beats. So I do draw some parallels between these two. This is just a different bass line in comparison to what's happening here when we go from D to E minor, because the upper voices are doing the exact same thing. We have D and D, D and D, F sharp and F sharp, F sharp and F sharp, and A and A, A and A. So this G right here is a chord tone. We don't need to mark it. We then get F sharp, E, B, and G. This F sharp is an accented non-chord tone. It's really this E minor triad that is important. That is our tonic triad. So we have 3 going to 1. That's kind of an unusual progression, but not really. I mean, yeah, I don't really. It's unusual because we don't see it all that often, more so than the fact that it like breaks or defies logic or anything. It's just a stable chord going to a stable chord. We would usually expect, more dominance going on in and around the area before we see 2 chords like this, but we see 1 go to 6 all the time. We see 4 to go to 2 with some regularity and vice versa, so it is what it is. It's a stable chord progression. It doesn't really change the trajectory. It's just it's a relatively bland progression, and that's okay, because it's been very concentrated so far, very dense. But then we get D sharp for the first time, which really starts to solidify the idea of E minor. D sharp, B, F sharp, and A, which is B7 over D sharp. That's 5, 6, 5. And then we get our tonic triad, E, B, E, and G, E minor. Again, before we cadence on B major, B, B, D sharp, and F sharp, which is our 5 chord. And then we get our 5-1 resolution finally. Instead of going from B major to B minor, after all these half cadences in the key of E minor, we finally get our resolution to E minor. However, that E minor is recontextualized as a chord in the key of D major. It just happens, it's like a substitute for the B minor chord that we get on the beat afterwards. It's just the resolution comes in towards the end, and we are modulating to the key of D major because we have a perfect authentic cadence in the key of D major happening at the end of this phrase, and we stay in D major the whole time. So this E minor chord is our 2 chord, and it goes to B, D, and G, which is G major in first inversion. That's 4, 6. So another sort of bland progression, because we have 2 chords that are more or less functioning the same. I mean, they have 2 notes in common, and really the voices aren't moving too much. We get some vocal exchange, but other than that, really the voices are not super far apart. We have some static activity happening in 2 of the voices, and then the voices swap in the notes that they don't have in common, so it's a stable progression. Here we have C sharp, A, E, and G, which is A7 over C sharp, that's 5, 6, 5. And then we go to D major, D, A, D, and F sharp, which is our tonic triad and root position. Then we go to A major again, A, C sharp, and E, which is our 5 chord. And then we have G, B, E, and G. Again, you can call this a 2-6 chord, the same way that you could also call this chord here a 4 chord. It's really the same thing going on at the end here. This D could be the chord tone. Sorry, I marked the wrong chord tone because I was thinking about what I was going to say while I was marking it, but no, I think this D is a passing tone. It doesn't really matter, it's just kind of going with your gut. I think either analysis is correct because 4 or 2-6 could be expected in this situation. They're both predominant chords. They're both commonly found in cadential situations. Then we have A, C sharp, and E. That's our 5 chord again, A major, with the passing 7th in the bass, and then we cadence on 1. And if I'm not mistaken, this is really just the same progression that we had at the end of our 4th phrase. 1, 2, 3, 5th phrase, apologies. But yeah, we're seeing the same we're seeing the same material recycle this, but the cadence is exactly identical, but we have differing material in the actual phrase itself prior to the cadence. And as we are getting ready for our final cadence in the key of D major, we actually get something interesting at the end. We cadence in an imperfect authentic fashion because we have F sharp in the melody, not D natural, which is definitely unusual. I think we have seen an imperfect authentic cadence or two at the end of chorale, but it's very uncommon to see imperfect authentic cadences at the end of the chorale, so it's interesting that we're seeing it here. But we're going to stay in the key of D major regardless. So we have C sharp, A, E, and A. That's C major, sorry, oh my god, that's A major over C sharp, which is 5, 6. And that goes to D major, D, D, F sharp, and A, which is our tonic triad. Passing tone in the bass and the alto before we get F sharp, D, A, and A, which is the same sort of figuration we saw here in the last phrase of the first system. 5 going to 1, that 1 chord being re-rotated to root position. However, I think we're tempted to call this just a tonic triad, but what we see here is another passing C natural here, which would be the equivalent of calling this D major chord on the beat before a secondary dominant, more specifically 5, 6 of 4, the same way that we saw it here prior to our modulation to the key of E minor. So hopefully we're going to see some G major happening afterwards. I kind of see it happening on beat 3 here. Regardless, on beat, actually that C natural sort of interrupts the analysis of calling this a root position chord happening here, but we see that the bass is doing the same thing, and the alto has the same thing sort of happening, even though there's parallel motion between the two voices. The same sort of figuration is happening between these two. But regardless, after this passing tone and after the rhythmic activity in the bass and the alto, we get G major, G, B, G, and B, which is where we would expect it to go. It's an incomplete triad, but still, it resolves the way we would expect. And then we have some passing tones in the lower voices, A, C sharp, G, and B. We almost have a passing 5 chord here, but this B right here would be a suspension, and the fact that we don't resolve to A immediately is kind of suspect, and if I were to analyze it that way, it would be kind of suspect. The way that it is now, I'll just mention the fact that there's the ingredients for the chord there, but we don't get it in its full context. So we have 4 going to B, D, D, and G with a passing tone in the alto. That's G major in first inversion, which would just be taking the chord and rotating it into first inversion, so no need to reanalyze the Roman numeral. We then have A, D, F sharp, and A. That's D major in second inversion, so that's a 1-6-4 chord. We're seeing it in a cadential context here. This B is a non-chord tone before we get A, C sharp, E, and G. That's A7 in root position, so we have 1-6-4 and 5-7. working together. Before we get D major, D, A, D, and F sharp in that interesting voicing where we don't have the tonic and the melody like we would expect. We have the F sharp and the melody, so, or the third of the chord rather, so it's interesting that we're seeing it voiced that way, as it's uncommon to end the chorale in an imperfect authentic cadence. But that concludes today's analysis. Thank you so much for watching the video and supporting the channel by doing so. I really enjoy making these videos and analyzing music in general, but right now I'm working on Bach and I've been really enjoying the journey thus far. We're 167 episodes in. People are subscribing to the channel. It's been a really marvelous experience making videos and interacting with those of you who have engaged in the comment section or have sent me personal messages. Thank you so much for all of the positive feedback and also the comments. The peer review is very helpful for my own practice and just getting better as an analyst. It's also really interesting to hear other people's takes and, further justify my takes in the comment section. It's been a really wonderful opportunity and experience. But I'm going to end the video on that note. Again, thank you so much for watching the video and supporting the channel. If you're interested in following me along on this journey, feel free to subscribe and hit the notification icon so that you can be notified of when I upload once a day. And I look forward to tomorrow's analysis. I hope you take care.